Zixter stood at the observation window of the diplomatic station, watching the blue planet below. He had studied this world called Earth for many months. The beings living here were called humans, and they fascinated him in the way a museum display fascinates a visitor. They were interesting, but ultimately not important in the greater scheme of galactic affairs. He was from the Enlightened Collective, a civilization that had dominated space for thousands of years. His species had conquered worlds, absorbed inferior cultures, and expanded their empire across vast regions of the galaxy. The collective was advanced, organized, and powerful beyond measure. Humans were none of these things. From what Zixter observed, humans were primitive. They had only recently developed space travel. Their technology was crude compared to the collective. They fought constantly among themselves, divided by invisible lines they called borders and nations. They were driven by emotions that made no logical sense. They loved, hated, feared, and hoped with an intensity that seemed wasteful and inefficient. Yet something about humans intrigued him. They were determined in a way he did not fully understand. They created art and music for no practical reason. They wrote stories about things that had not happened yet. They sacrificed for others, sometimes even strangers. These behaviors served no survival purpose, and yet humans engaged in them constantly. Emma Brooks was the human who had caught Zixter's attention most. She was a military captain, a leader of soldiers. Her face was lined from years of stress and difficult choices. Her eyes held something Zixter could not quite name. It was not fear. It was not hope. It was something between determination and resignation. As if she had accepted that hard things must be done, and she would be the one to do them. When the message arrived from the collective, Zixter knew nothing would be the same. The rogue faction was coming. They called themselves the True Collective, and they believed that the diplomatic approach was weakness. They believed that Earth should be conquered immediately. The collective's leadership had lost its nerve, they claimed. Humans should be either enslaved or eliminated. There was no middle path. Zixter tried to warn the collective command. He sent data about human behavior patterns, their capacity for cooperation, their ability to innovate under pressure. He suggested that conquest would not be simple. The response he received was dismissive. Humans were weak. They had no ability to fight a true military power. The matter was already decided. The first ships arrived during Earth's daytime. They did not come in peace. They came to demonstrate power. The alien vessels descended through Earth's atmosphere and moved to positions above the largest human cities. Their weapon systems activated. Communication satellites exploded in bright flashes. Entire networks of human technology went dark in seconds. Then came the transmission. The voice was cold and absolute. It spoke in the human language, translated by the collective's systems. The message was simple: surrender or be destroyed. All human governments must place themselves under collective rule immediately. Resistance would be met with total annihilation. The offer stood for 12 hours. Zixter watched from the observation station. He expected panic. He expected chaos. He expected humans to accept surrender as the only logical choice. What he saw instead changed everything he thought. He knew Emma Brooks was already moving. She had been briefed the moment the alien ships appeared. She moved through the military command center with purpose, giving orders that set thousands of people in motion. Coast Guard ships raced away from ports. Evacuation sirens began to wail across coastal cities. Millions of humans began to move inland, but they did not run in chaos. They organized. They helped each other. They moved people who could not move themselves. They gathered children and elderly humans and guided them to safety. Volunteers appeared from everywhere, directing traffic, providing water, and comforting those who were frightened. Zixter accessed the human communication networks. People were speaking to each other through devices. He expected fear. He heard determination. A factory owner told his workers to leave the city safely. Teachers guided their students to shelters. A young man held his girlfriend's hand and said, "We will survive this. We are humans. We survive." His voice was steady. He truly believed it. Emma made contact with other military commanders around the world. Within minutes, a coordinated plan was taking shape. Humans would not use their weapons yet. First, they would protect their people. Then, they would find a way to fight. In a hospital, a doctor named Patricia organized her staff. They moved patients to safe locations. Medical supplies were loaded onto vehicles. A nurse asked her if they should flee the city. Patricia said no. Doctors stay. There would be injured people soon. They would be needed here. The nurse understood. She began to organize surgical equipment. A young engineer named Lucas received the evacuation notice and knew immediately what he needed to do. He worked for a technology company that built communication systems. He knew something that most people did not know. He knew how the collective's technology worked. He had studied it, because that was the kind of person he was. He began to consider how human systems could be modified to work around alien interference. 12 hours passed quickly. The deadline came and went. Humans had not surrendered. The cities were emptied of civilians. The beaches were empty. The parks were empty. Only soldiers remained, waiting in positions the collective could not see, ready to fight. Emma stood in the underground command center and watched the displays. She could see the alien ships above the cities. She could see the weapons targeting empty buildings. She took a deep breath and pressed the communication button. She spoke directly to the collective leadership. She did not speak of surrender. She spoke of humanity. She spoke of the choice that humans had made. She said that humans would not give up their world. Humans would not accept slavery. Humans would fight because that is what humans do when their existence is threatened. She promised that the battle would be long and costly. She promised that the collective would regret underestimating them. Her voice was steady. It carried no anger, only absolute certainty. She ended the transmission and turned to her officers. She said, "Prepare for resistance. They just made a terrible mistake." Zixter listened to Emma's words, and something inside him broke. He had been trained to believe that inferior species could be managed, controlled, and conquered. But listening to Emma, seeing the way humans had organized, witnessing their refusal to panic, he understood that he had been wrong. The collective had made a fatal miscalculation. They had measured human strength by the wrong measures. They had looked at technology and weapons in numbers. They had not looked at the thing that truly made humans dangerous. They had not looked at the will to survive. They had not looked at the capacity to choose death over slavery. They had not looked at the way humans came together when everything was on the line. Zixthor realized that the collective was about to learn a hard lesson. They were about to discover that the most powerful force in the galaxy was not advanced technology or superior numbers. It was the human decision to stand and fight, no matter the cost. The war for Earth was about to begin, and humanity had already won the most important battle. They had refused to break before the first shot was fired. The first attack came at dawn. Alien ships descended on military bases across the globe. They fired weapons that turned buildings to dust and left craters where forests had been. The collective expected quick victories. They expected human defenses to crumble. They expected surrender within days. They got something different. Emma's forces did not try to match the collective's firepower. Humans could never win a direct battle with superior technology. So they did not try. Instead, they used the one advantage they had, Earth itself. They used mountains and forests and underground tunnels. They used roads that only humans knew about. They used knowledge of their own world against an enemy that had no such knowledge. When the collective attacked a military installation, they found only empty buildings. The soldiers had already moved. Emma scattered her forces across the planet, making them impossible to target. The collective fired weapons and destroyed structures, but they destroyed empty places. They killed few soldiers because the soldiers were not where the weapons struck. Lucas was in an underground facility, working with a team of engineers and computer programmers. The collective was jamming all human communication systems, but Lucas had an idea. He had been studying alien technology for years. He knew the frequencies they used. He knew the patterns they followed. His team began building a new kind of transmitter, one that used the collective's own technology against them. It was crude compared to what the aliens could do, but it was clever. That was what humans were good at. When they lacked power, they used cleverness. Within 2 days, Lucas and his team had a functioning system. Suddenly, humans could communicate again, despite the jamming. Emma received the news with a grim smile. She immediately began coordinating attacks that seemed random and disconnected. In truth, every action was connected to a larger plan. Every soldier knew what every other soldier was doing, even soldiers on different continents. The collective began to notice something unusual. Human attacks were becoming more effective. Alien supply lines were disrupted. Weapons installations were sabotaged. Technology was stolen or destroyed. The collective was not losing battles, but they were not winning either. Every time they seemed close to victory, humans slipped away like water through fingers. In a hospital far from any city, Patricia was treating wounded soldiers. The collective had attacked the civilian shelter by mistake, or perhaps not by mistake. Humans were bleeding and dying, and Patricia worked without rest. She had only basic medical supplies now. The advanced equipment was destroyed or hidden. She did what she could with what she had, and her patients survived because she refused to let them die. A soldier named Kevin came to her ward with shrapnel embedded in his shoulder. Patricia removed it and closed the wound. Kevin did not complain. He asked when he could return to his unit. Patricia told him to rest. He said he could not rest. There were others who needed him. He stood up, despite her objections, and walked back into the fighting. Emma watched the casualty reports accumulating on her screen. Each number represented a human life lost. She carried the weight of every death. She had to make decisions that meant people would die. There was no way to avoid it. But she made sure that every death meant something. Every casualty was counted. Every sacrifice was remembered. The collective was confused. They had advanced sensors and powerful weapons. They had superior numbers and better equipment. But they could not achieve victory. It was like trying to catch smoke with their hands. The more they pressed, the more they failed. Some of the collective's commanders began to question their tactics. Perhaps they should attempt negotiation, they suggested. The leadership refused. They simply needed to push harder. They needed to use more force. The humans would break eventually. All species broke eventually. Emma made a decision. She would not just defend. She would attack. She chose a target. A collective supply depot that was delivering weapons to their 4 bases. It was heavily guarded, protected by alien soldiers and advanced weapon systems. A direct assault would fail. Human soldiers would die for nothing. Emma did not plan a direct assault. She planned something else entirely. A team of pilots flew old human jets to the supply depot. The jets were primitive compared to collective technology, but they were fast and maneuverable. The alien defense systems had trouble tracking them. The jets struck quickly and disappeared into clouds and mountain valleys where the collective sensors could not follow. The supply depot burned. Tons of weapons and ammunition were destroyed. The collective lost 17 soldiers in the attack. Humans lost 3 pilots. It was an exchange the collective had not expected. They had thought humans would fear death too much to make such costly attacks. They had thought self-preservation would override all other considerations. They were wrong. A young collective observer named Vexal was stationed on the ground, coordinating with his superiors. He watched the supply depot burn and began to understand something disturbing. Humans were willing to die. This was not theoretical. He was watching humans choose death in order to damage the enemy. He tried to report this to the command center, but his superiors dismissed his concerns. Humans were irrational, they said. Eventually, their irrationality would be their weakness. Zixter received reports from multiple sources. Humans were adapting faster than any species the collective had encountered. Every time the collective changed tactics, humans responded within hours. Every time the collective developed a new strategy, humans found a way to counter it. The collective was not evolving. Humans were. He decided to act. He knew it was against protocol. He knew it could be seen as betrayal. But he had to do it. He contacted Emma through a secure channel that the collective did not know he possessed. She was suspicious. Why would an alien help humanity? What was his angle? Zixter explained that he was an observer, and he had observed something important. He told her about the collective's weaknesses. He told her about command delays. He told her about the way decisions had to move through bureaucracy before they could be acted upon. Emma listened and understood. The collective was powerful, but they were slow. Humans were not as strong, but they were fast. Speed was a weapon that the collective had not considered. Emma formulated a new plan. She would strike at the command vessel itself, not with weapons, but with precision. She would target the communication systems. She would target the navigation systems. She would do what humans did best. She would create chaos that she could exploit. Zixter provided coordinates and security codes. He provided information about the vessel's weak points. He did this knowing that if discovered, he would be executed. But he did it anyway. He could no longer stand apart and observe. He had to choose a side. He chose humanity. The attack came 3 days later. Human forces hit the command vessel from directions the collective did not expect. Explosions tore through multiple sections. The collective's leadership was evacuated, but not before damage was done. Communications were disrupted. Navigation systems were compromised. For the first time, the collective was not certain of victory. Zixter watched the command vessel retreat from Earth orbit. He knew the collective would return. The battle was not over, but something fundamental had shifted. Humanity had proven that they could hurt the collective. Humanity had proven that they could fight back effectively. The age of easy conquest was over. Emma stood in her command center and received the report that the alien vessel was withdrawing. She allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. Then she moved on to the next crisis. The war was far from finished. But for the first time, humans had shown that victory was possible. The collective's response was swift and terrible. They arrived with their full military force, no longer interested in playing games. They unleashed weapons that destroyed entire cities in seconds. Millions of humans died. Families were erased. Generations were wiped from existence. The casual brutality of the attack was beyond anything humans had experienced. Emma sat in the command center and watched the casualty counts climb. New York, London, Tokyo, Mumbai, Cairo, Sao Paulo, Sydney, one city after another burned. The numbers climbed so fast that her mind could not process them. 20 million. 50 million. The death toll kept rising, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She wanted to break. She wanted to give up. She wanted to surrender just so the killing would stop. But she thought of Kevin and Lucas and Patricia. She thought of all the people who had already died for the choice to resist. She could not let their sacrifice mean nothing. She made a call to her remaining commanders. She said the same thing to each of them. We continue fighting. There is no other choice. If we surrender now, everything is lost. We fight until we cannot fight anymore. Lucas received word that his family was in one of the destroyed cities. He tried to contact them through the damaged communication systems. There was no response. He sat in silence for a long time, understanding that his parents and his sister were gone. But there was still work to do. There was still the mission. He returned to his station and continued working on the communication system. His hands were shaking, but his focus was absolute. Patricia's hospital was destroyed by a strike that came without warning. The building collapsed. She pulled herself from the rubble, along with 3 of her nurses. They emerged into a landscape of devastation. The city was gone. Refugees stumbled through the ruins, looking for loved ones they would never find. Patricia looked at the nurses and said the same thing Emma had said. We continue. We find somewhere to work. We help whoever we can find. If we stop, we let the dead down. They found a makeshift shelter in an underground garage and began treating the injured. Some people came with wounds from the attack. Others were sick or dying from lack of clean water. Patricia and her nurses worked without food or sleep. A woman asked Patricia if Earth would survive. Patricia did not have a good answer. She said that if they survived, they would rebuild. First, they had to survive. Kevin was with a military unit defending a position in the mountains. They had been given new orders. They were to destroy a collective weapons platform that was launching missiles at human cities. The platform was heavily defended. An assault would be suicide. All of them knew it. None of them hesitated. Kevin led the assault himself. He climbed the rocky slopes toward the platform, expecting to die. Alien fire came down like rain. His companions fell around him. He kept moving. He threw explosives at the platform. Alarms began to scream. The platform started to shut down. Then his team received new orders. Retreat immediately. The platform's destruction would trigger a chain reaction. They had only minutes to escape. Kevin ran down the slope with 3 other soldiers. Behind them, the platform exploded, taking the surrounding weapon systems with it. Kevin made it to safety, but barely. He reported the mission complete. The collective would have to send new weapons platforms, which meant delays and disruptions. It would save thousands of lives in the short term. But the cost was not yet calculated. The collective was getting angrier. Zixter watched the devastation from his station and felt something breaking inside himself. He had helped humanity resist, thinking they would find a way to survive. Instead, he was watching an entire species being murdered. The collective was not trying to conquer anymore. They were trying to exterminate. He sent a message to Emma. He told her the truth. The collective was planning to systematically destroy every human city until humanity surrendered or ceased to exist. There was no way to defend against what was coming. The collective had decided that if they could not have Earth, no one would have it. Emma received the message and understood that the war had entered a new phase. Humanity could no longer win through military tactics or clever strategies. The collective had too much firepower. The only question now was whether humanity would break. She made a decision. She would not surrender. But she also would not ask her people to throw their lives away. She would make a final broadcast to the entire world. It would explain why they fought. It would explain what it meant to be human. That night, Emma sat in front of a camera with her face lined from stress and grief. She spoke directly to humanity and to the collective. She did not speak of victory. She spoke of meaning. She said that humans were not the strongest creatures in the galaxy. Humans did not have the best technology. Humans did not have the numbers or the weapons to defeat the collective through force. But humans had something else. Humans had the ability to choose. Humans could choose to stand and fight even when defeat was certain. Humans could choose to value each other even when death was approaching. Humans could choose to maintain their dignity and their principles when those choices meant suffering. She spoke about a young soldier named Kevin who was willing to die for his companions. She spoke about a doctor named Patricia who would work until she dropped, not for payment or recognition, but because people needed help. She spoke about an engineer named Lucas who was using his mind to fight against impossible odds. These were not soldiers or scientists or professionals doing their duty. These were humans. And humans were choosing to be better than their circumstances. She said that the collective could destroy every building on Earth. They could kill every human alive. But they could not kill the idea that humans would not break. They could not kill the decision to remain human, to remain decent, to remain connected to each other, even in the face of extinction. Her words spread across Earth and beyond. Humans heard them and understood that surrender was not an option. The collective heard them and did not understand. The collective command could not comprehend a species that would choose death over slavery. It was illogical. It was illogical. It was inefficient. It was incomprehensible. Yet it was happening in front of their sensors. A moment came when Zixter was observing a refugee camp. It was a place where humans had gathered to survive. There was almost no food. There was almost no clean water. Disease was spreading. Most of these humans would probably die. Yet they remained organized. They cared for their children. They shared what little they had. An old human child could not eat the thin soup that was the camp's only food. Another child, also hungry, gave half of her portion to the younger one. Both children would go hungry, but both would survive another day. Zixter recorded this moment. He did not know why. He just knew that he had to remember it. This was not the behavior of a species that was breaking. This was not the behavior of creatures that had given up. This was something the collective had lost centuries ago. This was compassion. This was choosing others' well-being over your own survival. He understood then that the collective was facing something it could not defeat. The collective could destroy Earth. They could destroy humanity. But they could not destroy the thing that made humans human. And that was more powerful than any weapon they possessed. The war continued, but it was becoming clear that it would be fought on terms humanity could understand. Humanity would not surrender. Humanity would not break. And the collective would have to choose between genocide and something else. Something neither species had ever chosen before: compromise. The collective's leadership stood in their command chamber and studied the reports. Every metric showed human defeat approaching. Cities were destroyed. Millions were dead. Supplies were running low. By all logical analysis, humanity should have surrendered weeks ago. Yet the reports continued to show resistance. Humans were still fighting. Humans were still organizing. Humans were still refusing to accept the inevitable. One commander finally asked the question that others were thinking but afraid to voice. Why was this happening? Why did humans not behave the way every other conquered species had behaved? The collective leadership did not have a good answer. They were encountering something their centuries of conquest had not prepared them to face. They had always assumed that species would choose survival above all else. Humans were choosing something different. Humans were choosing principles, values, and meaning. These were inefficient choices. These were impractical choices. Yet humans were making them anyway. Zixter was called to present his analysis to the leadership. He stood before them and told the truth. He said that humanity was not primitive. Humans were adapted to a harsh world. They had learned to cooperate because cooperation was necessary for survival on a death world. They had learned to sacrifice because sacrifice was sometimes the only way to protect those they loved. They had learned to value meaning and purpose because a short life without meaning was worse than a short life with dignity. The collective had grown soft. They had grown accustomed to easy victories. They had forgotten what it felt like to fight for survival. They had forgotten what it felt like to fight for survival. Humanity had reminded them. Humanity had demonstrated something that the collective had lost: the willingness to stand against impossible odds and refuse to surrender. The collective's leadership was divided. Some were furious at this suggestion. How dare Zithar suggest that a primitive species had anything to teach them? But others listened. Others began to realize that perhaps they had made an error in judgment. Perhaps humanity deserved something other than annihilation. A faction within the collective began to advocate for negotiation. They suggested that an alliance with humanity might be valuable. They pointed out that humans had demonstrated abilities the collective had not expected. Perhaps there was benefit in partnership rather than conquest. The opposing faction was enraged. They said that any suggestion of compromise was surrender. They said that the collective's strength came from total dominance. If they negotiated with an inferior species, they admitted weakness. They would not allow it. The debate raged for days. The military continued to bombard Earth, but attacks slowed as the collective struggled with its internal conflict. Emma recognized what was happening. She decided to make a move that could change everything. She sent a message directly to the collective leadership. She did not send it as a military commander threatening war. She sent it as a human speaking to the collective's hearts. If they still had such things, she said that Earth would not surrender to conquest. But Earth was willing to negotiate with any species that treated them as equals. She proposed something radical: partnership. Humanity was willing to share knowledge with the collective. Humans were willing to trade with the collective. Humans were willing to form an alliance based on mutual respect rather than hierarchy. She invited them to send representatives to a neutral location to discuss terms. She promised safe passage. She promised that humans would not use the opportunity to attack. She was offering something the collective had not expected. She was offering them the chance to stop being conquerors and become something else. She was offering them the chance to be partners. The collective was shocked. No species had ever made such an offer. Every other species they had encountered had either surrendered immediately or fought until they were eliminated. No species had the audacity to propose equality with the collective. Yet, Emma's message resonated with something in the collective leadership. Some of them were moved by it. They recognized the courage it took for a smaller, weaker species to offer respect to those who had threatened to destroy them. They saw in Emma's message something they had not felt in centuries: honor. True honor, not the honor of dominance, but the honor of standing by your principles, even when you could lose everything. The military commanders opposed negotiation. They argued that Emma was lying, that this was a trap. But enough of the collective's leaders agreed that the risk was worth taking. They decided to send negotiators to meet with Emma. The meeting took place in a neutral station in orbit, above Earth. Emma arrived with a small delegation of humans. Zithar was there as an intermediary. When the collective representatives entered the chamber, Emma stood and extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting. The collective had never experienced such a gesture. It was physical contact between potential enemies. It was an act of trust. One of the collective representatives understood its meaning and reached out to take Emma's hand. The gesture was awkward for both species, but it carried immense weight. Two very different beings were acknowledging each other as equals. The negotiation lasted for hours. The collective wanted to understand what humans wanted. Emma explained that humans wanted one thing above all else: to survive as a free people. They wanted to determine their own future. They wanted to join the broader galactic community as partners, not subjects. The collective asked what humans could offer in return. Emma described human creativity, human adaptability, and human resilience. She explained that humans had things to teach. She explained that the collective had become complacent and that partnership with humans could help the collective remember who they used to be. Some of the collective representatives listened with understanding. Others were still hostile. But the seed of an idea had been planted. Perhaps there was another way. Perhaps the age of simple dominance was ending. Perhaps a new era of cooperation was beginning. By the end of the meeting, a provisional agreement was reached. The collective would cease all attacks on Earth. They would recognize Earth as an independent world with the right to self-determination. In exchange, humanity would enter into trade negotiations with the collective. Humanity would share certain knowledge about efficient resource management and social organization. Humanity would consider joining a new coalition of galactic species based on mutual respect rather than hierarchy. It was not a complete resolution. There were still details to work out. There were still forces on both sides opposed to the agreement. But it was a beginning. It was humanity's first step into the larger galaxy, as an equal partner rather than a conquered species. Emma and Zixter walked through the station together after the negotiation ended. Emma asked him why he had helped humanity. Zixter considered the question. He said that he had realized something fundamental. Strength did not come from advanced technology or superior firepower. True strength came from knowing what you valued and being willing to fight for it. Humanity had demonstrated that strength. The collective had forgotten it. By helping humanity, he was helping the collective remember. Emma understood. She told Zixter that he was now humanity's ambassador to the collective. He would help both species learn to understand each other. It was a dangerous position. It would require him to live between two worlds. Zixter accepted. He had already made his choice. He would live between worlds if it meant helping both species find a better path forward. 1 year after the ceasefire, Zixter sat in the collective archives and began to write his official report on the human situation. It was the most important document he had ever created. It would be studied by collective scientists, military strategists, and philosophers for generations. He knew this. He felt the weight of it. He began his report by describing Earth as a death world. Not merely in terms of dangerous environment and harsh climate, though it was certainly that, but death world in a deeper sense. On Earth, survival had never been guaranteed. Humans lived short lives compared to many species. Food was not always available. Weather could kill. Predators could kill. Disease could kill. Nothing on Earth was designed for the comfort of living creatures. Everything had to be fought for. This reality had shaped humans in ways the collective had not understood. Because life was short and uncertain, humans had learned to pack their existence with meaning. They had learned to love intensely because they did not know if they would have tomorrow with the people they loved. They had learned to fight hard because the alternative was death. They had learned to work together because individuals could not survive alone on a harsh world. The collective had evolved on a comfortable world. They had abundant resources. They lived long lives. They had time to perfect their systems and their technology. But comfort had made them soft in ways they had not recognized until they faced humanity. They had forgotten what it meant to struggle. They had forgotten what it meant to choose something larger than personal survival. They had forgotten what it meant to matter. Zixter described Emma Brooks in detail. He explained that she was not exceptional among humans in terms of intelligence or ability. She was exceptional in her willingness to bear the weight of command. She was exceptional in her refusal to break under impossible pressure. She was exceptional in her capacity to inspire others to believe in a future worth fighting for. These qualities were not unique to Emma. They existed in every human. But Emma embodied them with particular clarity. He wrote about Lucas, the engineer who had continued to work even after losing his family. He wrote about Patricia, the doctor who had kept helping people even when she herself was starving and exhausted. He wrote about Kevin, the soldier who had volunteered for a suicide mission because others needed to survive. He wrote about ordinary humans who had become heroes simply because they refused to give up. Zixter explained that the collective had measured human strength by the wrong metrics. The collective had looked at technology and military hardware and physical power. The collective had not looked at the things that could not be measured with instruments. The collective had not looked at hope, sacrifice, love, and purpose. These unmeasurable qualities had proven stronger than any weapon. The report went on to describe a fundamental shift in collective understanding. For thousands of years, the collective had viewed other species as either useful or useless, either valuable or worthless. They had believed that strength was inherent and unchangeable. Weak species were always weak. Superior species were always superior. This belief had shaped their entire approach to galactic affairs. Humanity had shattered this belief. Humanity was weak in many ways. Humans were fragile, short-lived creatures with primitive technology. Yet humanity was strong in ways the collective had not measured. And these unmeasurable strengths had prevented the collective from achieving conquest. More importantly, humanity had taught the collective something about themselves. The collective had begun to recognize their own weaknesses. They had become dependent on technology. They had become slow and bureaucratic. They had lost the hunger that had once driven them to excellence. They had become comfortable with dominance instead of striving for improvement. By fighting humanity, the collective had begun to wake up from a long sleep. They had begun to remember what it felt like to be challenged. They had begun to recognize that they had been declining for centuries, slowly losing the qualities that had once made them great. Zixter concluded his report with a recommendation. He recommended that the collective change their entire approach to other species. He recommended moving away from conquest and dominance. He recommended that the collective learn from humanity. He recommended that the collective seek partnerships based on mutual respect rather than hierarchy. Some readers of the report were enraged by these recommendations. How dare Zixter suggest that the collective learn from an inferior species? How dare he suggest that the collective's way was wrong? But others read the report with understanding. They began to see the logic in Zixter's analysis. They began to recognize the truth in his words. Emma received information about Zixter's report. She read it carefully and understood what he had done. He had written truth about humanity, but he had also written truth about the collective. He had challenged his own people to look in a mirror and see what they had become. This took courage that humans understood well. Emma began her new role as Earth's ambassador to the collective. She worked to establish trade agreements and cultural exchanges. She helped humans understand the broader galactic community. She helped other species understand humanity. Her job was to build bridges between worlds. Lucas continued his work in technology, but now he was collaborating with collective engineers. Together, they were creating new systems that combined human creativity with collective technical knowledge. The results were better than either species could have created alone. Lucas was helping to prove that partnership produced better results than competition. Patricia expanded her medical work to train other species in human approaches to healing and care. She taught that medicine was not just about fixing what was broken. Medicine was also about caring for people as individuals with inherent value. The collective had very efficient hospitals. Patricia taught them that efficiency was not everything. Sometimes people needed compassion more than they needed efficiency. Kevin received a new assignment. He was asked to work with collective military officers to establish joint defense protocols. He was asked to help the collective understand that there were ways to be strong that did not involve overwhelming force. There were ways to be effective that involved respect for opponents. Kevin was helping to reshape how the collective thought about military power. Zixter became more than just an ambassador. He became a symbol of the new partnership between humans and the collective. He was the being who had believed in humanity when his own people did not. He had made a choice that cost him greatly. He could never fully return to collective society. He was now forever marked as the one who had sided with an inferior species. But Zixter did not regret his choice. He had discovered something that the collective had lost, the meaning that came from standing for something larger than personal advancement. He had discovered what it meant to have principles that mattered more than comfort or safety. 5 years after the ceasefire, the collective formally disbanded their conquest protocols. They began reaching out to other species with offers of partnership instead of demands for surrender. They began establishing a new kind of galactic community based on mutual respect. It was partly because of Zixter's report. It was partly because of Emma's diplomatic efforts. But most importantly, it was because humanity had proven something that could not be ignored. Humanity had proven that the measure of a species was not their technology or their military power. The measure of a species was their willingness to stand for what was right, even when doing so meant sacrifice. The measure of a species was their capacity to love, to hope, and to choose meaning over survival. Emma stood on a balcony overlooking Earth as the sun set. She thought about the people who had not survived the war. Millions of them. They had not lived to see this moment. They had not lived to see Earth join the galactic community as an equal. They had not lived to see the collective change course and begin to treat other species with respect. But their sacrifice had made it possible. Every life lost had contributed to the decision to resist. Every death had added weight to the choice to fight. Without those sacrifices, without that willingness to die for something larger than personal survival, none of this would have happened. Emma decided that she would make sure it did not forget. She would make sure that future generations of humans understood what their ancestors had done. She would make sure that humans never forgot the cost of freedom. She would make sure that humans understood that sometimes the only way to be truly strong was to be willing to stand alone against overwhelming odds and refuse to break as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Emma looked up at the stars. Somewhere up there, the collective was discovering what it meant to be partners with humanity. Somewhere up there, other species were learning that the galaxy was larger and more complex than they had realized. Somewhere up there, Zixter was continuing his work to build understanding between worlds. And on Earth, humans were continuing to be human. They were continuing to love, to sacrifice, to hope, and to fight for things larger than themselves. This was what made them dangerous. This was what made them strong. This was what would shape the galaxy for centuries to come. The war had ended, but the real transformation was just beginning.